Hello, this is my presentation on land degradation and desertification for sustainable agriculture. Um, let's start. So land degradation is it's an issue with a wide scope. There's a lot of causes and effects, and as it relates to sustainable agriculture, it's kind of the whole the whole compass of sustainable, or it encompasses all of sustainable agriculture. All the social components, economic components, ecological components, uh, because it is the cusp of the problem facing unsustainable agriculture, which is that the land eventually becomes unusable and thus unsustainable. So this is what we're trying to prevent with sustainable agriculture, and it can be defined as a gradual decline in soil quality, like you see in these images I've included here, that show sort of cracked earth. Now, famous example of this was the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression. Thousands of people had to move, mostly to California from areas like Oklahoma, because they were not able to grow crops anymore. And this still happens worldwide. Sometimes as catastrophic as it was in the Dust Bowl. Uh, if you don't know what that is, that's when the American Midwest was overtilled and became essentially a desert, with massive dust storms, uh, as a consequence of early industrial methods of farming, which continue to this day, just with the help of more synthetic fertilizers and things. So let's take a look at some of the factors of land degradation. So we understand this is a all-encompassing issue, right? So you're going to see a lot of other things fall under the scope of land degradation, and that includes planting on slopes and erosion, over fertilization, salinization, monocultures, overtilling and soil compaction, deforestation, and lack of crop rotation. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with planting on slopes and erosion. So, when you think of a desert, you think of shifting dunes, right? And land degradation is, also referred to as desertification. Uh, with the decline in plantable land worldwide, people have started to plant in areas that they haven't before. Also, with the onset of new technologies, we plant in places we haven't before. The problem is there was a reason we did not plant in those places, mostly on hillsides and in hill country. Uh, and this is because when we till those areas, they fall apart. It's only really good for one harvest season. And then you have to do a lot of labor intensive and super expensive work to get it back in a usable condition. And if you can't get it back in a usable condition, then no one can use it. And obviously, that's not something we want. There's also over fertilization. I'm referring specifically to synthetic fertilizers there. And what will happen there is people will uh, have the fairly logical thought that more fertilizer equals better plants, right? Better production. And they will just dump way too much into the soil. And what happens is you end up actually poisoning the plants with excessive nutrients. Anything in excess can poison that. People can get water poisoning if they drink too much. Same holds true for plants. So if that happens, it is bad. Salinization also goes hand in hand with land degradation. And what happens with salinization is maybe irrigation water becomes stagnant and unflowing and it seeps into the soil, or a bunch of extra nutrients from fertilization is, finds its way into a river or something. And what happens there is the excess salts that come from fertilizers, that come from soil locked salts that aren't supposed to be floating around can get whisked up and carried around in the soil. So basically, underground flooding uh, occurs, and it carries too much salt. It sorry, this is a separate issue. So yeah, excess of salt kills plants. Bad. Also, I did not list this, but what can happen is basically underground flooding, where if an irrigation system isn't properly managed, it will seep out into all the crops, and this causes salinization as well because it draws mineral from the soil. And when this happens, the crops again will die because they essentially get choked out by the lack of uh, soil locked air. And monocultures cause land degradation because they suck the soil dry. Uh, Being all of a certain kind of plant, they all need the same kinds of nutrients and contribute the same things back to the soil, most of which are waste products to them, which they don't really need. So, yeah, they suck the soil dry and they need stuff artificially put in, which in turn causes other issues and leads to wholesale land degradation. Also, an issue overtilling and soil compaction. As you can see here, I've put up a picture of somebody tilling. What happens when you run over topsoil in your tractor or your big uh, equipment that you have rented out from whatever company you're leasing for, or maybe if you're an independent farmer that you've bought for yourself? Those big machines crush the soil. They also choke the plants out by removing oxygen and air bound in the soil, and as well as that, they create sort of this squished barrier for these plants to overcome when they're growing. So we end up with a lot of shallow root systems because crops can't dig past with their roots the point where the tractor has crushed down the soil. Uh, Overtilling is an issue because obviously if you throw up a bunch of loose dirt, it's going to dry out pretty quick if nothing's on it. And that's exactly what happens when they harvest a monoculture. You end up with a bunch of overtilled land that's just going to dry and blow off as dust, which is, again, exactly what happened in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. And we do not want a repeat of that. Um, Overtilling can also cause lack of biodiversity in the soil. This is a little weak, but it's because it's so linked to monocultures and modern agriculture that it's basically assumed that if you're overtilling, you're going to put in a bunch of the same crop. Um, yeah, it does create a single habitat that only one kind of plant can adapt well to, and that's the sort of plants that we have cultivated. It's not always necessarily a good thing to have only cultivated plants in your farm because you need to maintain the micro ecosystem. Uh, deforestation, deforestation is, I think, the leading cause of land degradation, and that is when they go in and clear cut a bunch of trees to make way for farmland. Obviously, that's bad forestry, that's bad agriculture. Bad agriculture. It reflects negatively on both and is a terrible practice that should be put out so that people in agriculture and forestry can hold their heads high. Now, deforestation is the leading cause of land degradation because what it does is it takes away any cover that the soil might have had. And forest soil is typically very biodiverse. It has a lot of microorganisms in it that depend on the trees. And when you take away the trees, those microorganisms die. And the soil quality goes down with that. Also, the sun beats hard on the soil with no tree cover, and it can become dusty and degraded. And it gets sent back to the first primary stage of ecological succession, which means it's basically waiting for something like a lichen or another pioneer to cultivate it again, which takes potentially hundreds of years and is not a good thing. Now, lack of crop rotation, that plays back into monocultures. I already talked about that. All right, I forgot to change the picture here. Effects of land degradation. So you end up with desertification. Obviously, that's bad. I talked about that a bit. That's when, again, you're sent back to the first stage of ecological succession. You have a blank slate. Nothing wrong with deserts, obviously, where they're naturally occurring. We're supposed to be, but we shouldn't be creating deserts everywhere because the ecosystem cannot handle that much empty land. It results in a lot of species dying out and just destroys balance of the biodiversity of the area. Now, when a when a farm decides that it's going to use too much fertilizer or maybe get salinated or something, the nutrients also overflow into the surrounding area. Now, this is bad because it not only affects the farm and desertifies that area, it can also seep into nearby woodlots, nearby rivers, causing the same problems further down to other farms uh, and to the environment because this all ends up running down and seeping into the ocean or into lakes, which are hotspots of biodiversity. And too many nutrients in the water can result in mass die-offs of fish, for example, can result in the die-off of certain trees that depend on specific kinds of water, especially in wetlands. Uh, and it is very, very bad for biodiversity and the health of the ecosystem. Now, extreme erosion is also really bad for reasons we've discussed. I don't know why I put that there again. See how the causes and effects of land degradation are very hard to separate from each other because it's such a all-encompassing issue. Uh, Bad water retention and waterlogging, that's the underground flooding thing I was talking about earlier. Uh, Again, that can affect the surrounding ecosystem and is very bad. Now, here are a few real-life examples of land degradation, and these are large scale. So, you may have heard that China is pursuing a program called the Great Green Wall to reclaim a large area of the Gobi Desert, which is slowly encroaching because of agricultural exploits at its borders. Now, while they might say it's successful, it's unfortunately not. A more critical look at China's effort to reclaim the land shows that it unfortunately falls under the same bad land practices that got the land turning into desert in the first place. They're planting monocultures, this time not of crops, but of trees, which are super susceptible to disease. And not only are they monocultures, they're types of trees that aren't even adapted to dry environments, and they're just sucking more life out of it. So keep updated on that situation. That is not going well right now. And in the country of Niger, uh, there's a pretty big problem with desertification and land degradation. So much so that their entire government has to enforce sustainable agriculture because it's located, Niger, if you didn't know, is located between the Sahara and the savannah. So it's an area of crossover and very dry. It does get heavy seasonal rains, and the problem with this is that the erosion is really, really bad if you decide to overtill there. Because you get these heavy seasonal rains that wash away everything, you get the rest of the year dry, and yeah, it can turn into desert very easy. And unfortunately, they did step into that pitfall there. And Iceland's an extreme example because only 2% of Iceland is covered in forest. It didn't used to be that way. Around 30%, uh, 60% of it was covered in forest way back when the Vikings settled there. And they took advantage of the land for agriculture and mostly for grazing sheep. And they overgrazed and now the land is unusable. And reclamation efforts are taking place in Iceland through the use